The storm did not begin with swords. It began with speeches, with the scratch of styluses on parchment, with a voice rising in the Senate, cloaked not in blood, but in logic. In the dying days of the Roman Republic, the seeds of self-destructs were not sown on distant battlefields, but in the marble heart of Rome itself. The empire to be stood on the shoulders of 1,000 victories. But beneath the gleaming surface, cracks had begun to split the foundation. Greed was no longer shameful, it was structural. The Senate no longer debated policy, it debated vengeance. And somewhere, in the shadows behind the Forum's tall columns, a new breed of Roman was being born. Not the citizen soldier, but the power broker. Not the servant of the state, but the architect of its ruin. It is tempting, in hindsight, to imagine the fall of the Republic as inevitable as if fate had scripted Caesar's march across the Rubicon long before his sandals touched the river. But that illusion is comforting and false. The truth is darker. Rome had chances. It had voices who warned, hands that tried to hold the center. But again and again, it chose expediency over principle, conquest over cooperation, cruelty over cohesion. It murdered reformers. It exiled thinkers. It turned generals into gods, and then wondered why the Republic bled. In this, Rome did not fall. It committed suicide. The tale you are about to hear is not merely a chronicle of battles and betrayals. It is a psychological autopsy of a state that devoured its own children, extinguished its own ideals, and shattered a 1,000-year future to serve a single, brutal present. This is the story of the Roman Republic's last century, of Marius and Sulla, of Pompey and Crassus, of Caesar and the long red tide he unleashed. But more than that, it is the story of how empires die not with an enemy at the gates, but with silence in the forum, with ambition that outpaces allegiance, with men who confuse greatness with domination, and above all, with a people who stop asking, what comes next? History is rarely a warning. It is often a mirror, and Rome, more than any other, is a reflection in which the powerful still see themselves and refuse to blink. They came not from the sword, but from the soil. Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus were brothers born into nobility, but forged in the friction between privilege and conscience. Their father had fought with Scipio Africanus. Their mother was daughter to the destroyer of Carthage, and yet these sons of the Republic would come to threaten the very class that birthed them. Tiberius was the first to see the rot not in Rome's enemies, but in Rome itself. The fields lay empty. The peasantry, who had once tilled the land and bled for the legions, now wandered as displaced wraiths through a city bloated with marble and misery. Landowners, empowered by conquest and corruption, had turned small farms into vast estates run on slave labor. The Republic, drunk on expansion, had abandoned the men who built it. Tiberius, elected tribune in 133 BCE, dared to speak the unspeakable, that wealth had limits, that land must return to those who served, that Rome owed its people more than conquest and coin. His land reform bill ignited the Senate like a torch. In a powder house, they called him a traitor. They called him a tyrant. But above all, they feared him not because of his power, but because he reminded the people of theirs. He was murdered in the shadow of the Capitoline Hill, beaten to death, with a leg of a broken bench by fellow senators. His body was dumped into the Tiber like waste, like warning. But the current carried more than blood. A decade later, his brother Gaius rose, fiercer and more radical. He did not merely call for reform. He called for justice, for grain subsidies, for colonization, for equestrian courts to punish senatorial abuse. He spoke with fire, with fury, with vision. The people loved him. The Senate plotted again. When the final moment came, Gaius stood on the Aventini Hill, trapped with his supporters. Knowing the knives were coming, he ordered a servant to take his life before the mob could. His head, severed and filled with molten lead to match the bounty placed upon it, was carried through the streets. The message was clear. Rome would not tolerate vision, not from within. The Gracchi were not rebels. They were reminders that the Republic could still be saved. But Rome had decided otherwise. It would rather silence its conscience than change its course, and killing its reformers. It did not preserve peace, it buried prophecy. What the Gracchi foresaw, in their brief blaze of courage, was a truth too vast for their time, that if Rome did not feed its people, protect its land, and restrain its own greed, it would live only to die, and die. It would not in a day, but in a slow, unraveling spiral of power eating itself. The future was warned, and the future was murdered. The ashes of the Gracchi had not cooled before another name emerged, not of noble lineage, but of blood-earned ambition. Gaius Marius, born to an equestrian family in the Italian town of Arpinum, was no patrician. He was a soldier to grinder, a man who had clawed his way up Rome's brutal ladder by merit and steel. When the old aristocracy sneered, Marius answered with victories. When the Senate hesitated, he conquered. He was the embodiment of Rome's most dangerous illusion that success could save a system in decline. Elected consul an unprecedented 7 times, Marius rewrote the rules of Roman warfare, and in doing so, rewrote the fate of the Republic. He opened the legions to the landless poor. Once, soldiers had to own property to fight for Rome. Now, any man could serve not for glory, but for bread. The consequences were immediate and irreversible. Soldiers no longer fought for the Senate or for the ideal of Rome. They fought for their general. For Marius, and later, for far darker men, loyalty shifted from republic to personality, from state to savior. Rome had created a new weapon and wrapped it in flesh. Marius's reforms were hailed as brilliance, and they were. He saved Rome from barbarian invasion. He filled its ranks, but every victory he won was also a brick removed from the Republic's foundation. He was the hero who set the stage for catastrophe. When his old rival, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, emerged from the same war-torn soil, ambition met its reflection in the dark. The two men were mirrors and monsters of Rome's new reality. Personal feuds became national crises, armies became political tools, and in the shadow of Marius, Rome would learn what happens when a state allows loyalty to become property. It was not law that ruled anymore, it was legacy. And Marius, though blind to it, had summoned a demon the Senate could no longer contain. Not a barbarian at the gates, but a citizen with a legion and a grievance. He came from the same cracked earth as Marius, but Lucius Cornelius Sulla was cut from colder stone. Where Marius sought glory in the clash of battle, Sulla sought something deeper, darker, a total reordering of Rome, shaped by vengeance and silence. Pale-skinned, red-haired, with ice behind the eyes and a mask of nobility, draped over ruthless calculation. Sulla was Rome's first lesson in what happens when ambition no longer fears the law. He began as a loyal servant, a general, a tactician, a consul. But when command of the Eastern war against Mithridates was stripped from him and handed to Marius, Sulla did the unthinkable. He turned his army toward Rome. For the first time in the Republic's history, a Roman general marched on his own capital. It was a line no one had dared cross, and once crossed, could never be uncrossed. The Senate panicked, the people fled. Marius escaped into exile. But the real damage was not in buildings burned or names struck from rolls, it was in precedent. Sulla had shown that power no longer flowed from the people or the Senate, but from the sword. And swords had memories. He left to fight in the east, and returned to find Marius had seized Rome in his absence, reigniting the fire. The city bled, then burned. In 80 BCE, Sulla took it back and declared himself dictator, not for 6 months, as tradition allowed, but indefinitely. And then came the proscriptions, lists of names enemies of the state he claimed posted publicly, marked for death. Their property was seized, their families exiled. Their heads were displayed in the forum like meat on a butcher's hook. Some were senators, Some were merely suspected. All were examples. Rome became a graveyard of whispers. A republic ruled by fear. And yet, in a gesture as bizarre as it was chilling, Sulla eventually resigned, having slaughtered his enemies, rewritten the laws, and crushed dissent. He simply walked away to his villa, to his wine, to the silence of a man who believed the work of ruin was done. But it wasn't. Sulla's shadow stretched long. He had taught a generation that legality was flexible, that violence could sanctify change, and that the Republic was no longer sacred. Among the boys who watched his rise, one learned more than any other. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar, and the lesson he took from Sulla was simple. If you must break the world to shape it, break it cleanly. He walked through a Rome that had forgotten how to breathe. The Republic still stood in name, but its soul had been mutilated, its laws twisted, its elders silenced, its people broken into factions of fear and allegiance. Gaius Julius Caesar, born into the patrician Julie, but raised in the shadow of Sulla's terror, learned early that nobility no longer meant safety. His aunt was the widow of Marius. His father had served the Republic, but his name was now whispered like a curse. When Sulla returned and began his purges, Caesar was only 16 and already hunted. He refused to divorce his wife, Cornelia, daughter of a Marian loyalist, despite Sulla's personal demand. For the defiance, Sulla stripped him of his priesthood, his inheritance, his dowry, and nearly his life. Caesar fled into the hills, into the silence of exile, carrying nothing but his name and a deepening fire in his chest. And there, amid the wolves of a dying republic, the boy who would become history's pivot point began to harden. He was captured by pirates, ransomed, and upon his release, hunted them down and crucified them not for power, but for control. When he spoke in court, he did so with the sharp edge of poetry and precision, like Cicero with a dagger. He studied rhetoric in Rhodes, battled in Asia Minor, and watched as every institution he'd once believed sacred turned to sand in his hands. Rome, to Caesar, was no longer a home, it was a battlefield in disguise. He returned to the city, shrewd and hungry, understanding what others still denied, that the Republic was no longer guided by ideals, but by performances, massive virtue worn by men who bartered in loyalty and blood. Caesar would master that performance. He would charm the masses, flatter the Senate, and make alliances not with his heart, but with his horizon. He was not yet the conqueror of Gaul, not yet the tyrant in the Forum, but already he was dangerous. Because unlike Sulla, Caesar did not destroy the Republic with rage. He did it with patience. He smiled, he learned, and beneath that smile, Rome's most beautiful dagger waited to be drawn not against its enemies, but against itself. The Republic had taught him well. It had taught him that power is fragile, but perception is stronger. And if truth could be manipulated, if justice could be delayed, then perhaps the future wasn't something to inherit, it was something to steal. Rome had always feared kings. Since the expulsion of Tarquin the Proud centuries earlier, the word Rex had been poisoned in the mouth of every Roman citizen. Yet in 60 BCE, the Republic, already cracked and crumbling, opened its gates to something far worse, not a king, but a trinity. 3 men, Julius Caesar, brilliant and ambitious, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, the celebrated general with a hunger for legacy, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, whose wealth could buy anything except glory. They formed a private alliance, bound not by ideology, but by grievance. The Senate had denied their ambitions, scorned their proposals, mocked their victories, so they turned to each other. History would call it the First Triumvirate, but it was no formal body, it was a shadow government, a handshake that unmade centuries of republican order together. They divided the empire like thieves divvying up a corpse. Caesar took Gaul, craving conquest. Pompey secured Spain, hoping for admiration. Crassus seized the east, driven by envy. Of both was Caesar's soaring popularity, Crassus's wealth, and Pompey's war-hardened prestige. They wielded more power than the Senate dared confront. Laws were passed not through debate, but coercion. Votes were bought. Opposition was silenced. Rome, still pretending at legality, had become a theater, and these three men wrote the script. But unity among titans cannot hold, not in a city where ambition is inherited like a curse. Crassus, desperate for military glory to match Caesar, and Pompey marched to Parthia in 53 BC and met annihilation. His army was butchered. His head, severed and molten with gold, was presented to the Parthian king as mock tribute to Roman greed. The balance was broken. With Crassus dead, Rome was no longer shared, it was contested. Pompey, once Caesar's ally and now his rival, drifted back toward the Senate, who embraced him not out of love, but out of fear of what Caesar had become. Caesar, still in Gaul, watched, calculated, and understood. The Republic had made its choice. It had backed the man who promised order over the one who promised revolution. And so Caesar began the long, inevitable walk back toward Rome, toward Pompey, toward war. But the seeds of civil strife had not been planted on a battlefield. They had been planted in a dining room 10 years earlier, over wine and ambition, when three men decided that the future of a republic could be divided like territory. The republic was not murdered by barbarians or betrayal. It was dissected by its own architects, and soon only one would remain. It was just a narrow stream, winding through the northern Italian countryside, its waters low and unimpressive. The Rubicon was not the Rhine or the Nile. It had no grandeur, no myth. But to the Roman state, it was a sacred boundary. It marked the line no general was allowed to cross with an army. To step over it was to declare war on the Senate, on the Republic itself. And in 49 BCE, under the thick gray sky of winter, Julius Caesar stood at its banks and made the decision that would define his name for eternity. His face, calm. His eyes, unreadable. His legionaries, hardened veterans of the Gallic campaigns, waited without command. Their loyalty tied not to Rome, but to the man before them. The Senate had ordered Caesar to disband his forces and return as a private citizen. But Caesar knew better. They would not forgive him. They feared his popularity, his brilliance, his victories, and above all, the precedent he had become. To return without arms was to walk into political exile, perhaps assassination. And so, standing at the edge of legality and defiance, Caesar spoke the words that history would etch in flame. Alia Iacta estate. The die is cast. He crossed the Rubicon. Rome held its breath, then unraveled. Panic swept the capital. Senators fled. Pompey, once master of the legions, now found himself outmaneuvered by a man he had underestimated too long. He fled south, then east, gathering forces in Greece. Caesar entered Rome not as a conqueror, but as a cleanser proclaiming peace, order, clemency. But behind the words lay strategy, sharp as steel. He moved swiftly, efficiently. Italy surrendered without a true battle. The Republic, bloated with fear and devoid of unity, crumbled in the face of a single will. It was not force alone that made Caesar's march successful, it was clarity in a city of hesitation. He had chosen in a world of divided loyalties. He had embodied one. The Rubicon was more than a river. It was a mirror, one that showed Rome what it had become. A state where power no longer obeyed law, but where law bent to the weight of power. The Senate still existed, consuls still sat, but the soul of the Republic had drowned in that shallow stream. Alongside all the illusions that once defined it, Caesar had not killed the Republic yet, but he had proven one terrifying truth: it could be killed. And now, the war for what remained would begin not just with swords, but with memory, with destiny. The wind howled over the plains of Pharsalus. a dusty stretch of Greek earth never meant to carry the weight of empires. It was here, in 48 BCE, that the Republic poured itself into not in principle or ideology, but in flesh. On one side stood Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, once the favored son of Rome, cloaked in legitimacy, commanding a force larger, better supplied, and blessed by the Senate. On the other stood Julius Caesar, with half the numbers, half the supplies, and all the momentum of fate. The world called it a civil war, but that word carries too much civility. This was patricide on a national scale. Every javelin hurled was brother against brother. Every command issued a betrayal of oaths once sworn to the same republic. And Caesar, calm, calculating, methodical, knew exactly where to strike. Pompey's army had the advantage, but it lacked what Caesar's men bled for: belief. His legions, forged in the fires of Gaul, were not soldiers, they were instruments of will, loyal to their general as to a god. When the battle began, it was not chaos, it was precision. Caesar's lines held, then bent, then snapped forward. In silence, Pompey, overconfident and indecisive, hesitated when he should have crushed. And in that hesitation, Rome's future turned. A hidden cohort of Caesar's infantry, lying in ambush, struck the cavalry flank, collapsing Pompey's advantage and driving his horsemen into ruin. His lines shattered, his hope died, and Pompey, the man once called Magnus, fled not like a hero, but like a ghost. He ran to Egypt, to Cleopatra's court, seeking safety among foreign crowns, only to be greeted by betrayal, assassinated upon arrival. His head presented to Caesar like a trophy. Caesar did not smile. He wept. Whether the tears were sincere or for show, none could say. But Rome understood the message. Opposition was not just futile, it was extinguishable. Versailles was more than a victory. It was a requiem. The last true resistance to Caesar's rise was broken, and with it, the final illusion that the Republic could return to what it was. The Senate had backed Pompey, and now the Senate knelt. What was left of Republican dignity dissolved into survival instinct. Caesar pardoned many, executed few, but the mercy was strategic, not sentimental. He did not want martyrs. He wanted submission. In the dust of Versailles, Rome made a choice. It would spend centuries pretending not to understand. It did not fall. It surrendered. And from that day forward, power no longer needed approval, it only needed momentum. Caesar returned to Rome not as a conqueror draped in bloody laurels, but as a man burdened with the weight of impossible expectations. The city itself, once the beating heart of a republic defined by law and custom, now pulsed to the rhythm of a single will. He moved quickly to reshape everything: the Senate, the courts, the calendar, the very identity of Rome. His reforms were sweeping, radical, and poetic in their ambition. He doubled the Senate's membership, filling seats with loyalists and provincials, attempting to forge a broader empire not just of lands, but of people. He reorganized the calendar, creating the Julian calendar that would outlast centuries, a symbol that time itself was now in his hands. Land was redistributed to veterans, the urban poor were fed, and infrastructure projects like the Forum Julium rose. Monuments not only of stone, but of new order. Yet beneath the grand gestures lurked unease. Many senators whispered that Caesar sought kingship, the very fate Rome had expelled centuries before. His title of dictator for life was not merely administrative. It was a crown in all but name. Some saw in his eyes the quiet impatience of a man who had outgrown the Republic's fragile scaffolding. But Caesar moved beyond fear and faction. He governed with a scholar's mind and a poet's soul, quoting Homer, dreaming of immortality. Through legacy, he claimed to restore the Republic, yet rebuild it in his image, a paradox that both entranced and terrified. The people loved him, the elites feared him, allies became enemies, and enemies, potential martyrs. Around him, the old guard gathered, whispering dark plans. For Caesar was not just a man. He was a turning point, a storm. A question the Republic could not answer. Was Rome to remain a city of laws or become a city of one? And beneath it all, the question lingered like a shadow. Could an empire survive the murder of its own future? Caesar's Rome was not the Republic reborn. It was the Republic's ghost haunting the marble halls and empty forums, a reminder that power, once centralized, rarely returns. The die had been cast once more. History held its breath. The morning sun rose over Rome on March 15th, 44 BCE, a day that would echo through eternity as the Ides of March. The Senate gathered in the theater of Pompey, a building steeped in irony, for it was where Pompey himself had once ruled and fallen. Julius Caesar, dictator for life, entered the chamber, surrounded by senators who wore smiles like masks and carried daggers beneath their togas. Among them were men who had once sworn loyalty, now transformed by fear, envy, and despair into architects of his death. Marcus Junius Brutus, a man Caesar trusted as a son, held the sharpest blade of all. The conspirators believed they were saving the Republic that by killing the man who threatened Rome's soul, they could restore its light. As Caesar took his seat, the knives came swiftly. 23 wounds tore through flesh and armor, the echo of betrayal resounding in the marble halls. Caesar's last words, whether at two, brute, or a simple gasp, remained shrouded in legend. But the meaning was clear. The Republic had been murdered again, this time by those who claimed to protect it. The death was not just of a man, but of a vision, brutal, paradoxical, and shattering. Rome plunged into chaos. The Senate could not control the aftermath. Caesar's loyalists, led by Mark Antony and Octavian, moved with cold precision, turning the city into a powder keg. Public grief mixed with fury. The ideals that the assassins fought for seemed more distant than ever. The Republic, already fractured, cracked open completely. Civil war was no longer a threat, it was a certainty. The Ides of March was not an end, but a beginning. The collapse of an old world and the birth of another. Forged in fire and blood, the empire that had murdered its own future had done so twice, and history was about to witness what price such a murder would demand. The dust of Rome has long settled, yet its echoes refuse to fade. The empire that murdered its own future did not vanish quietly. It transformed, twisted by the choices of men who mistook dominion for destiny. From the bloodied Ides of March to the marble triumphs of Augustus, the Republic's corpse became the empire's foundation, a kingdom built on sacrifice, betrayal, and a relentless hunger for power. This story is not merely about ancient men and forgotten wars. It is a meditation on the fragility of ideals and the peril of forsaking them. Rome teaches that the death of a future is not always violent or sudden. Often, it is a slow suffocation, the silencing of voices who dared to speak, the erosion of law by ambition, the choosing of fear over faith and a people's promise. The empire that once dazzled the world did so because it dreamed of greatness. Yet, in killing its own future, it doomed itself to endless conflict, to a legacy haunted by ghosts of what might have been. The question that lingers in the empty forums, beneath the shattered columns, and beyond the stories told is simple yet profound. What does it mean for a civilization to betray itself, to murder the promise it once held? History offers no easy answers, only mirrors, and in those mirrors, we find reflections of ourselves, our power struggles, our moral compromises, our silent concessions to fear and ambition. The empire's doom was not just Rome's. It is humanity's warning etched in stone and blood. If this story moved you, subscribe for more untold histories that shaped our world. The past is never truly past. It waits, like ashes in the wind, ready to ignite the flames of tomorrow's truth.